So today we're going to talk about the integument, which is going to consist of the skin and all of the kind of accessory and appendages of the skin. Okay, so put here, the word itself means covering. And so this is going to be the covering of our body. So it's going to cover the external part. Okay, and so again, it's going to contain the skin and its appendages. Okay, and so we'll talk about what those appendages are. Okay, so those are going to be things like sweat glands. They're going to be hairs and nails, things like that. Okay, and so here is a picture of the integument right here. So we're going to talk about the epidermis. We're going to talk about the dermis. We'll talk a little bit about the subcutaneous area. This is not part of the skin, but it's important to talk about because it's going to be what the dermis and the epidermis sit on top of. Here are some of the different appendages that are a part of this. So you can see hair follicles. You're going to see different types of glands in here, blood vessels. We're going to have nerve endings, specific types of nerves. And so all of this is going to kind of comprise the integument. Now, depending on where you are in the body, the skin can be very thick or very thin. Okay, so it's going to, so skin varies in thickness. Okay, so some areas are going to be very thin, so 1.5 millimeters. And then other areas can be up to 4 millimeters thick. Okay, and so think about like the skin of, maybe your wrist versus the skin of, your palm or your fingers or the bottoms of your feet. Okay, so very thin skin, also like your eyelids, that's very thin skin. That will be kind of on the thin side. And then the areas that are the thickest are going to be your kind of your bottoms of your feet and your palms. Okay. Now, the main function of skin is going to be protection. We will go through kind of all the different functions of skin a little bit later. I first want to kind of go through what the skin is comprised of, and then we can talk about how those different parts add for protection, but also some other things. But protection is going to be kind of the number one function of this system, okay? Now, when we talk about the skin, it's going to have two layers, okay? And the first layer is going to be the epidermis. Okay, and the epidermis is going to be composed of epidermal cells, or epithelial cells, sorry. Composed of epithelial cells. Okay, and this is the outer layer, so outermost layer. And it is going to mainly act as a protective shield. Protective shield. Okay, because it's going to be the first line of defense. Just to kind of give you some information about this term epi. So epi means upon. Okay, and so epi means upon the dermis. And the dermis is going to be our next layer of skin. Okay, so now we have the dermis. So this is the second layer of skin. The dermis is going to be the major bulk of the skin. So it's actually going to be the thickest part of it. Okay, so makes up bulk of the skin. It's going to be tough and it's kind of leathery. and it's composed mainly of dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay? The dermis is going to be what's vascularized. Okay, so this is where blood vessels are going to be. So if you look in this image, the epidermis does not have any blood actual kind of entering into it. All of the capillaries are going to be below in the dermis. So that's why if you get a kind of shallow paper cut that's just in the epidermis, you don't actually have any blood. It's not going to bleed until you actually get down to the dermal layer where there is blood vessels. Okay? And the way that the nutrients reach this epidermis is through kind of the dermis. So the dermis is going to have, you know, the blood, the oxygen, all of that type of thing that's going to be in it. It can then diffuse into the lower layers of the epidermis. The upper layers of the epidermis are actually dead, and we'll talk about that. But these bottom layers will be considered living and will get all of their nutrients from the actual dermis. Okay? And so it is vascularized, and it's also going to have kind of nerve fibers. So we'll talk about some very specific type. And this is also going to be the location of, you know, the hair follicles, the glands, and we'll talk about that. Okay? Now, again, this next part I'm going to talk about is the subcutaneous. So this is not part of the actual skin, but we do want to talk a little bit about it because it is going to be a supporting structure. Okay, so the cutaneous tissue is going to be the skin. So subcutaneous means below the skin. Okay, so this is going to lie deep to skin, right? It can sometimes be called the hypodermis, or it also can be called the superficial fascia. Okay, and so the superficial fascia is just a different term because it's going to be basically sitting on the fascia. Okay, and so this is going to sit on top of the tough connective tissue, wrapping. Okay, and so that's the fascia of the skeletal muscles. So if you remember, we talked about kind of the muscles, how they have this outer structure that's kind of surrounding the skeletal muscles. Well, that's the another term is that the fascia, and so the superfascia will actually sit on top of that. Okay, so once again, this is not part of the skin, so not part of skin, but it does have some similar protective properties. Similar protective properties. Okay, and it's mainly going to be made out of, let me just kind of move this up a little bit so you can still have that. It's mainly going to be made up of adipose tissue and areolar tissue. Okay, so again, this is subcutaneous, adipose, and areolar tissue. So you can actually see it on this picture. It's going to be kind of down here. We have some adipose tissue that you can see. You can't really see much of the actual areolar, but it is in that area. Okay, and what this subcutaneous tissue layer is going to do is that it's going to store fat. Okay, so that's where the adipose comes in. So stores fat. And the fat will actually have a second purpose of kind of acting as a shock absorber. And it actually acts in insulation. Okay? Its second function is going to kind of be that it anchors skin to the underlying tissues, which is going to be muscle. Okay, so we'll just put muscle in there. And in this region, there are also going to be some specialized nerve endings, which we'll talk about, and some sweat glands will go down into this layer. All right. So we are now going to kind of focus in mainly on the epidermis and talk about it by itself. We're going to talk about the different types of cells, the different layers of the epidermis, and kind of get into those details. All right, so we have epidermis. All right, so this is going to be made out of epithelial cells, and they're specifically going to be keratinized, stratified, squamous. I never know how to say that one. Epithelia. Epithelium. Okay. There are going to be 4 cell types in the epidermis, and they're going to be 4 to 5 layers of the epidermis. So we will actually go through and name these layers. And so you've probably already looked at the Integument lab where you had to see slides of the different layers. So we'll kind of go into a little more detail about those different layers. Okay, so we're going to first talk about the cell types. And the first type of cell we're going to call the keratinocytes or keratinocytes. Okay, and so like the name implies, they are going to be cells that produce keratin. So produce keratin. Okay, and so this is going to be a fibrous protein that helps the epidermis helps give the epidermis its protective properties. Okay. In the epidermis, most of the cells are going to be keratinocytes or keratinocytes. Okay, so most cells are keratinocytes. Okay, so this is the majority of the cells you're going to see in the actual skin. The epidermis is going to be this keratinocytes. Okay, they are tightly bound together. Okay, and so this is going to help hinder water movement. Okay, because one of the main properties of the skin is going to be to keep the water inside of the body and not allow it to leave. Okay, so that is going to hinder movement of water so that they cannot, they protect against water loss. Okay. So they are going to come from the deepest, so where these are produced, they are going to be kind of coming from the very bottom layer of the epidermis, which we'll name in a little bit, which is going to be the stratum basale. So we'll write that here, arise from deepest part of the epidermis, okay, which is called the stratum basale, or basal. Stratum, you can just say basal. It's a little bit different of how you're supposed to say it, but it's the basal layer, which is the bottom, okay? These cells, keratinocytes, are highly mitotic, which means they go through mitosis and can reproduce themselves. So highly mitotic. Okay, and they actually will kind of live for about 25 to 45 days and then kind of be pushed out. Okay, when these cells reach the surface, they basically have died. So when keratinocytes reach, and I'm going to show a picture of this in a second, surface, they die, and they're basically full of keratin at that point. So they're no longer kind of living cells once they're at the top. Okay, so here is an image of kind of the skin, the epidermis. Okay, so it's kind of multiple different layers. And basically all of these orange cells, okay, so they're all around here, the orange ones, these are all going to be keratinocytes. Okay, so we can just label these. Oops, kind of ran out of sight. Okay, so all of the actual orange ones are going to be these. So they're very numerous, okay? They are going to kind of, this is going to be the lowest level down here, which we'll label later, which is going to be the stratum basale. And this is where they're going to start to produce and go through mitosis. As they go through mitosis, the cells kind of start pushing up, and then they push all of the other layers up with them. Once we get to this area right here, you're going to notice that you can stop seeing nuclei. These are basically all the dead layers of the keratinocytes. They are full of keratin at this point. They're dead. They don't have nuclei, and they will just flake off. Okay, so we lose a lot of skin during our lifetime. So again, all of these are going to be those these keratin cells. All right. Okay, the next type of cell that we're going to discuss are going to be melanocytes. All right, so we have melanocytes. Okay, so these are going to be, they're spider-shaped. So spider-shaped cells. And they produce melanin. Okay, melanin is a pigment. And we'll later talk about melanin and a little bit about skin color, but it is going to determine kind of what skin color that we have. There's a couple other pigments as well. Melanin is going to, this will be kind of a pigment that will then invade the keratinocytes, but it's produced in melanocytes. Melanocytes are going to be these other structures. And so we can just, why don't we just do this right now? So this cell right here, this kind of grayish one, and you can kind of see how there's these little projections that go through. These are going to be the melanocytes. So we'll label that. Okay, and you're gonna start seeing the melanin granules. So there's little tiny brown spots, and I'll post these pictures. You can see that these keratinocytes have lots of brown spots, and those brown spots are going to be the actual melanin granules. Okay, but this is going to be a melanocyte. Melanocytes are going to sit in the very deepest layer of the skin. Okay, so found in deepest layer of epidermis. Okay, and a little bit about melanin. Okay, so it is going to be made in membrane-bound granules. Okay, so there's a little membrane around it, and then the melanin will kind of be inside of it. Okay. So we have kind of these granules, and they will be transferred to the keratinocytes. Okay, and basically the basal keratinocytes will contain more melanin than melanocytes, so they'll actually be darker. So again, the melanocytes making it, but then they're giving it off to the different keratinocytes. Okay, so you'll have the little brown spots, and then this area has high amounts of the melanin granules. Okay, now so I just want to make this clear. So melanocytes make them, but they're not stored in the melanocytes. Okay, they're then going to be transferred into the keratinocytes. Okay, now melanin is a pigment. Like I said, oops, that's not how you spell that. Melanin. Okay, let's write that over. Melanin. So pigment. Ooh, very bad spelling right now. Pigment that shields the nuclei of the cell. So we have, it's kind of difficult to see in these pictures, but basically the the melanin granules will kind of be on top of, let me just draw this. So if we have kind of our cell, and then here is our nucleus. The melanocytes are the melanosomes, which are the granules, membrane bound. Those will kind of be on the top side of the nucleus, and they are shielding the nucleus from UV, so from damaging UV radiation. Okay, so if you remember, in the nucleus we have DNA, and DNA can be manipulated and damaged by certain types of chemicals and radiation. And so UV will actually come in here and can damage the DNA. And if the DNA is damaged, then that can cause issues. Okay, so like we'll talk about skin cancer in a little bit. So they're actually shielding, kind of acting as like a sunscreen on top of the nucleus to help protect it from being damaged. Okay, if you get too much UV radiation, the melanosomes can only do so much. And so they do protect, but they can only do so much. All right, so that is going to be the second type of cell that we have. The next type of cell that we're going to talk about are going to be called dendritic cells. Okay, and so the word dendrite may make you think of actual nerve cells, but these are not going to be nerve cells. They are star-shaped, and they arise from the bone marrow. And so the bone, once I say the bone marrow, you should start thinking these are actually going to be kind of immune cells. Okay, on our image right here, this is going to be the dendritic cell. So it kind of has these projections. So dendritic cells. All right, so these are going to be kind of immune cells. They are also called, and this is important because this may show up on the test, Langerhans cells. Okay, and these are phagocytic, which means that they eat. They're cells that eat things. Okay, so they are going to ingest foreign substances and are key activators of the immune system. Okay, they are going to have kind of these thin projections in between the keratinocytes and are going to be there to help protect. Okay, so if there's any type of bacteria that gets in here, it's going to be there to help protect. Okay. Our last type of cell that we're going to talk about is going to be what we can call the tactile cells. Tactile epithelial cells, but they are also called Merkel cells. Okay, so you can go either name. And these are going to be kind of in this region, which we're going to call the dermal junction. So they are right between, okay, so this is actually the dermis right here. All this part of here is going to be the epidermis. And so this right here is going to be kind of a tactile epithelial cell. I'll just put epi cell. Okay, and they're usually going to be associated with sensory nerve endings. So right here, this yellow structure is a nerve ending. Okay, so these cells are going to, let me just write that down. So associated with sensory nerve endings. Okay, and so these are going to be touch receptors. Okay, and tactile, just think of that word. It's kind of like you're feeling something, touch. That is going to be those cells. Okay, so just to review, we have the 4 types of cells. Okay, we have keratinocytes. We have melanocytes. Oops. We have dendritic cells and tactile epithelial. Okay. The majority of the cells are going to be the keratinocytes. Okay, where then dendritic cells are going to be these kind of star-shaped ones. We have melanocytes that basically kind of look like spiders. They have these legs that go off and are in between all of the different cells. And then we have these tactile epithelial cells. Okay, so once we talk about the different types of cells, we can now start to talk about the different layers of the actual epidermis. Okay, now the epidermis is going to have a different amount of layers depending on where it is. So let me just put layers of epidermis. Okay, and so there is something called thick skin. And we also have thin skin. Okay, so thick skin are going to be in areas that are going to be subject to abrasion. Okay, so something that's going to have a lot of friction. These are going to be like your palms. So this part of your hands, the fingertips, and the soles of our feet, okay? These are going to have 5 layers of epidermis, and we'll talk about the 5 layers. Thin skin is basically going to cover the rest of the body. Okay, and it is going to have 4 layers. Okay, and the layer that's going to be not here, but it's here is going to be called, so we'll just put this star. This is going to be the stratum lucidium. Okay, so this is the type that's only found in thick skin. Okay, thin skin does not have the stratum lucidium. It's going to have all the other ones, except for this one. Okay, so we're going to start going through the different layers of the skin and kind of look at where they are on a slide that's been prepped, and also kind of what's going on in those different sections. So we're going to start with the most basal layer. Okay, so this is going to be the lowest layer, and luckily it has the name that basically means basal layer. So this is going to be the stratum. And the word stratum or strata kind of means sheet. So it's kind of, these are layers. Okay, so this is going to be the stratum basale, or you can just basal. This is the basal layer. All right, so this is the deepest layer. It is sometimes called the stratum germinatum, which basically just means germinating. Okay, and if you know anything about the word, I guess I should do that. Germinating, you can think of it like a germinating seed. This is where they're actually are having new cells are being produced. Okay, so this is where kind of the, we have lots of mitosis going on. More cells are being produced. Okay, this is going to be attached to the lower level to underlying dermis. Okay, and it's going to have a wavy border line. So there's going to be kind of this wavy border line where the stratum basal is going to be on one side, and then the dermis is going to be down here. Okay, but it is going to be wavy, and we'll talk about that wave in a little bit. There is a single row of stem cells. Okay, and so again, that's kind of this mitosis. This is where all the cells are going to start being produced. Okay, and then in this layer, we also have the melanocytes. So the about 10 to 25% of cells in this layer, are melanocytes. Okay, so this is where they're going to be found and kind of producing the melanin. All right, so I have now a little bit of a different image than we saw before, but it's basically a non-cartoon image. And the lowest layer, so first of all, this is very similar. So this is the dermis right here. Looks like it's off. Okay, and so this layer right here is going to be the basal layer. Okay, so we're going to call this the stratum basale. All right, so this is going to be this lowest level where we have these stem cells that are producing all the cells that are going to be up above it. All right, now we're going to move on to the next layer. Okay, and the next layer, and we're going from the bottom down up. So we're starting deep. We're going to continue to go up. So now we're going to talk about this next section right here. This is going to be called the stratum spinosum. And what this means is the prickly, or you can think of like spiny layer. And I'm going to explain why it's called that. Okay, this is several layers thick. Okay, and it is named for its spine-like, so named for spine-like extensions of the keratinocytes. Okay, now the reason why they look, this is what they look like. So first of all, let me just show you. So this is going to be this next layer right here. And so I blew up some cells from this layer. It's a little bit of a different slide, but when this, you can only see these spines when this has been prepared in a slide. If you look at this in a living tissue, you do not see these spines. But the reason why they're named after these is because they have these little spikes. So if you kind of imagine it, it's like you have a ball and then these little spikes on the outside. And so these are the keratinocytes. And these little spikes that are in between the different cells, because they're actually stuck together. They have this tight kind of package and they have these different cell junctions in between them. When you prepare a slide, you expose that and the cell kind of pulls away, but you have these spikes where they're connected. And so that is why it's called this spinosum layer. So it's not always the easiest to see on a full slide, but if you can kind of see in between the different layers, and again, I'll have this picture for you, you can kind of see how there's these little spikes that are around the cells. Okay, so this is going to be that stratum spinosum. Okay, and so instead of being just kind of a single layer thick, this one's can be several layers thick. Okay, this one doesn't have several layers, but there are quite a few. All right, so a little bit about this. So these cells are going to have thick bundles of intermediate filaments. So cells have thick bundles of intermediate filaments. Okay, and so these filaments are tension resisting protein called pre-keratin. So these are on their way to becoming keratin, but they are not at this point. Okay, and one other thing that's going to be found in the stratum spinosum are going to be dendritic cells. So you find the dendritic cells here. It's kind of difficult to see. I'm not sure we can actually see any on this image. We can see definitely on the cartoon because they drew one there, but you can't actually see them in kind of this slide. All right, so moving on up. So we're gonna go to our next layer, which is going to be the stratum granulosum. Okay, so stratum granulosum. Okay, and this is the granular layer. Okay, so this is going to consist of 1 to 5 cell layers. Okay, and so they start to change appearance pretty dramatically from the stratum spinosum. Okay, so in which the keratinocytes change in appearance. Okay, and the change is happening because of keratinization. Okay, so what's happening is that the cells flatten their nuclei and organelles organelles begin to disintegrate. Okay, and they start to accumulate two types of granules, which is why they're called the granule layer. Okay, so accumulates two types of granules. Okay, the first is going to be called keratinohyaline. Okay. Okay, so these are going to help form keratin in the upper layers. And they also have something called lamellar granules, which are going to contain water-resistant glycolipid. Okay, so lipids are hydrophobic. So this lamellar granules are actually going to be secreted from the cell. So the keratin granules, those stay inside the cell, but this glycolipid is going to be secreted outside of the cells, and then it's going to help kind of slow water loss. All right, this is the last living layer. Okay, and the reason why it's the last living layer is because basically at this point, and because of what they're secreting, so let me just write these down first. So this is stratum granulosum. So they're secreting something that's water, kind of a water resistant. Basically, the dermis has all of the blood vessels, and at some point, the nutrients are not going to be able to move up any further. So it's like this tissue is now going to be too far away from the actual dermis to then be living. So these are going to be the last cells that are living. They are darker in nature. So if we look back at our cartoon, you're going to see they have darker, you have those melanocytes, the melanosomes inside of the cells. They're also going to have these other granules, and they're going to secrete this kind of fluid that's going to be on the outside, this glycolipid. So these are going to be the last living cells. From here on out, they're going to be basically dead layers of skin. All right. So the next layer is this special layer that is only found in thick skin. Okay, so, and I don't actually have a picture of this one, but this is called the stratum lucidium, and it is a clear layer. So when you look at it under a microscope, it looks clear. Okay, so this is found only in thick skin. Okay, so you'd find this on your palms of your hands, the soles of your feet. And it is a thin, translucent band. Okay, and so basically it's going to be a few layers of dead keratinocytes. Okay, so again, this is that kind of extra layer that you can find in thick skin. I don't have a picture of that one it's not on kind of on this one, but it does have the last layer. So this last layer is going to be the one that's found in everything. Okay, so this last layer is going to be called the stratum corneum, and it is called the horny layer. Okay, it has cells that have no nucleus, so cells anucleated. They are the outermost cells. So these ones are going to be in contact with the external world. It's often going to be 20 to 30 layers thick. So if we go back to our image, this thick layer is going to be the stratum corneum. Okay, so these are all dead. Okay, we're now going to have kind of full-fledged keratin, which consists of the pre-keratin and the glue that's kind of secreted from, or actually it's inside the cell, but that it's made in the stratum granulosum, that keratohyalin. Okay, its main function is going to be protection. And we shed these cells regularly. And this was kind of a gross fact that the book stated, but in our lifetimes, we lose about 40 pounds of skin cells. So that's a lot of skin. So if you can imagine accumulating all of that, that is again over your entire lifetime, because you're losing skin that entire time. But that is a lot of skin cells that you are ultimately losing. All right.